twins born of grandfather and granddaughter, the most devastating genetic tragedy of the Ozark Mountains. Deep in the remote valleys of Missouri's Ozark Mountains, where mist clings to ancient trees and isolation breeds secrets, a genetic tragedy unfolded that would shock medical professionals and local communities alike. This is the story of the Ledbetter family, whose generations of isolation and intermarriage culminated in a 1952 case that experts would later describe as one of the most severe documented instances of genetic collapse in American medical history. The Ledbetter homestead sat nestled in Blackberry Hollow, a remote valley accessible only by a winding dirt road that became impassable during winter months and spring floods. And the family had settled there in 1887 when Jeremiah Ledbetter, fleeing debt collectors from Tennessee, found this hidden pocket of land unclaimed and perfect for disappearing. What began as temporary seclusion gradually transformed into permanent isolation. As the family withdrew further from outside society with each passing generation, these hollows could swallow families whole, explains regional historian Dr. Margaret Wilkins. The Ozarks have always harbored communities that existed almost entirely separate from mainstream America, especially before roads and telephones reached the deeper regions. Some valleys went decades without outside visitors. By 1930, the Ledbetter property had become a compound of 4 crude cabins housing an extended family of 17 individuals. They survived through subsistence farming, hunting, and occasional trade with other isolated families in neighboring hollows. What made the Ledbetters particularly notable was their extreme suspicion of outsiders and their reluctance to marry beyond their immediate community. Thomas Ledbetter, born in 1895, became the family patriarch following his father's death in 1928, according to county records. Thomas had married his first cousin Martha in 1913, producing 5 children, 3 of whom survived to adulthood. Among these was Eleanor, born in 1916, described in a rare school record as withdrawn but bright. Eleanor's life took a tragic turn in 1932 when at age 16 she was married to Willis Codum, a man from a neighboring hollow 20 years her senior. County records indicate Eleanor gave birth to a daughter Judith in 1934. 3 months later, Willis Codum died in what was recorded as a hunting incident, though local rumors suggested otherwise. With no support system, Eleanor returned to her father's compound with her infant daughter. What happened in the intervening years remains largely undocumented, as the family had minimal contact with authorities or nearby towns. Occasional reports from rare visitors, primarily traveling peddlers and once a lost Forest Service worker, described the strange, closed household where outsiders were met with shotguns and silence. The profound isolation of the Ledbetter family created conditions where normal, societal boundaries eroded. As Judith grew into adolescence, the already problematic genetic closeness of the family would become catastrophically compounded. Medical anthropologist Dr. Howard Bennett explains, isolated communities sometimes develop their own moral codes that diverge significantly from mainstream society. Combined with generations of intermarriage, the genetic risks multiply exponentially. By 1949, according to later court testimonies, Thomas Ledbetter had developed an inappropriate relationship with his granddaughter Judith, then 15. Eleanor, by this point described in witness accounts as showing signs of mental distress and excessive reliance on homebrewed spirits, either could not or would not intervene. County records resurface in 1952 when a severe winter storm forced Eleanor to seek medical help in the nearby town of Thornfield. She arrived with her 17-year-old daughter Judith, who was in labor and experiencing serious complications. The attending physician, Dr. William Harrison, would later document his shock upon learning through examination and questioning that the father of Judith's twins was her own grandfather, Thomas Ledbetter, then 57 years old. The hospital staff were faced with an ethical and medical crisis unlike anything they'd encountered, recounts medical historian Patricia Coleman. Not only was this a case of forbidden relations, but the genetic implications were immediately apparent when the twins were delivered. Make sure you're subscribed to this channel to understand the full depth of America's hidden genetic tragedies. These forgotten histories reveal the devastating consequences that shaped entire communities and bloodlines, knowledge that helps us understand our complex past. The morning of February 12, 1952, began as another bitter winter day in the Ozarks. Snow had fallen continuously for 3 days, creating drifts that isolated even the most accessible communities. For the Ledbetter family in Blackberry Hollow, this isolation was nearly complete until 17-year-old Judith's labor complications forced a desperate journey. Eleanor Ledbetter appeared at our door nearly frozen, recalled nurse Ruth Simmons in a 1973 interview for the Thornfield Historical Society. She had somehow managed to pull her daughter on a makeshift sled for over 7 miles through snowdrifts. Both were suffering from exposure, and the pregnant girl was already experiencing seizures. Dr. William Harrison, the only physician at Thornfield's small medical clinic, immediately recognized the severity of the situation. Judith displayed symptoms of eclampsia, a dangerous pregnancy complication characterized by seizures and high blood pressure. But as he began treatment, Harrison noticed troubling physical characteristics in both mother and grandmother that suggested a history of genetic relatedness. Eleanor and Judith shared unusual physical features that medical professionals are trained to recognize, explained Dr. Harrison. In his medical notes, preserved in the county historical archives, both displayed the characteristic facial asymmetry, low-set ears, and shortened fingers that often indicate consanguineous parentage. When questioned about the father of Judith's babies, Eleanor initially claimed a traveling salesman had taken advantage of her daughter. However, as Judith's condition worsened, Eleanor finally revealed the truth. The pregnancy was the result of relations between Judith and her own grandfather, Thomas Ledbetter. The delivery that followed was traumatic and complicated. After 14 hours of labor, Judith gave birth to twin boys. The medical staff was immediately alarmed by the infant's condition. Dr. Harrison's notes describe twin A presents with severe cranial malformation, apparent cleft palate, and fusion of digits on both hands. Twin B displays microcephaly, bilateral ocular defects, and shows no response to stimuli. Infants exhibit cyanosis and respiratory distress. News of the births traveled quickly through the small community of Thornfield, population 382. The local sheriff, James Woodson, arrived at the clinic by early evening. His official report, filed February 14, 1952, states, informed by Dr. Harrison of suspected inappropriate relations within the Ledbetter family resulting in the birth of severely affected twin infants, have initiated investigation and contacted county prosecutor regarding potential charges. The situation grew more complex when twin B, later named Joseph, died 36 hours after birth. The cause was listed as congenital heart defects incompatible with life. The surviving twin, William, required specialized care beyond what the small Thornfield clinic could provide. Dr. Harrison arranged an emergency transfer to Springfield Baptist Hospital, 70 miles away. The surviving infant represents one of the most severe cases of genetic abnormalities I've encountered, wrote Dr. Edward Crowley, the pediatric specialist at Springfield. The constellation of defects suggests multiple recessive gene expressions, consistent with the reported close familial relationship of the parents. While William fought for his life in Springfield, authorities moved to investigate the Ledbetter homestead. Sheriff Woodson, accompanied by 2 deputies, made the difficult journey to Blackberry Hollow on February 18th, once roads became marginally passable. What they discovered painted a disturbing picture of extreme isolation and cultural divergence. The compound consisted of 4 crude cabins connected by covered walkways, housing 12 individuals from 3 generations of Ledbetters. Thomas Ledbetter initially threatened the officers with a shotgun, but ultimately surrendered when informed of the situation with his granddaughter and great-grandsons. The family had essentially created their own society, Sheriff Woodson reported. They possessed almost no modern conveniences, used a bartering system among themselves, and had developed their own dialect that was at times difficult to understand. Most disturbing was their apparent lack of comprehension regarding why authorities were concerned about their family arrangements. County anthropologist Dr. Helen Morris, brought in to assess the situation, noted, "The Ledbetter compound represents an extreme example of cultural isolation. Over 3 generations, they had developed practices and norms entirely divorced from mainstream society, including altered conceptions of appropriate familial relationships." This wasn't simply a case of individuals choosing to break societal taboos, but rather a community that had evolved in complete isolation to the point where such taboos no longer registered. Back in Springfield, baby William continued to struggle. Medical records indicate he suffered from hydrocephalus fluid on the brain, severe skeletal malformations, and cognitive impairment. Doctors performed emergency surgery to place a shunt to drain excess fluid from his brain, likely the first such procedure seen in this remote region of the Ozarks. The infant's conditions represent a tragic convergence of multiple recessive genetic disorders, noted Dr. Crowley. The close biological relationship between the parents allowed for the expression of harmful recessive genes that would typically remain dormant when genetic diversity exists. In this case, we're seeing the catastrophic results of generations of genetic isolation culminating in the closest possible relation. As February turned to March, three separate but interconnected dramas unfolded. Judith remained hospitalized, slowly recovering from her physical trauma but experiencing significant psychological distress. Baby William fought for his life in Springfield, and Thomas Ledbetter awaited his fate in the county jail as prosecutors determined what charges could be brought against him. The case had begun to attract attention beyond the immediate area. A reporter from the Springfield News Leader arrived in Thornfield on March 3rd, resulting in the first public article about the situation. The headline read simply, "Ozark Isolation Leads to Family Tragedy." By April 1952, as dogwood trees bloomed across the Ozark hillsides, the case of the Ledbetter family had transformed from a local medical emergency to a divisive moral and legal dilemma that split the communities of Shannon County. The surviving twin William had been transferred to state care, while his mother Judith remained under medical supervision. Diagnosed with what doctors then called nervous exhaustion, Thomas Ledbetter sat in the county jail awaiting trial, charged with immoral relations with a dependent minor. The legal system struggled to address the complex circumstances. County Prosecutor Harold Jenkins faced significant challenges in building his case. "The situation presents unprecedented difficulties," Jenkins wrote in his case notes, preserved in county archives. "The victim is unwilling to testify against her grandfather, appears unclear on appropriate familial boundaries, and expresses desire to return to the family compound. Medical experts confirm her developmental limitations, raising questions about competency to testify. The community's response fractured along distinct lines. In Thornfield and larger Shannon County towns, outrage dominated public sentiment. Church congregations held prayer meetings for the poor, deformed infant, and his troubled mother. Letters to the editor in the Shannon County Gazette called for the harshest possible punishment for Thomas Ledbetter. However, in the more isolated hollows and remote communities, reactions were more nuanced. Some families who had lived in similar isolation expressed concern that government men were interfering in private family matters. Others worried they too might face scrutiny for marriages between second or third cousins, common practices in areas where potential spouses were limited. What we witnessed was essentially a collision between two distinct cultural worlds existing within the same geographic region, explains cultural historian Dr. Patricia Wilson. The more connected towns, influenced by broader American values, reacted with expected moral outrage. The isolated communities, operating under different norms developed through generations of separation, saw the intervention as threatening. The case attracted the attention of Dr. Victor McCusick, a pioneering genetic researcher from Johns Hopkins University, who traveled to Missouri to study the Ledbetter family's genetic history. His findings would later form part of his groundbreaking work on inherited disorders. "The Ledbetter case represents a textbook example of genetic collapse," McCusick wrote. "4 generations of marriage between closely related individuals created a dangerous concentration of recessive genes." McCusick's examination of the extended Ledbetter family revealed multiple indicators of genetic distress, unusually high rates of stillbirths, infant mortality, congenital defects, and intellectual disabilities. His research would later influence emerging genetic counseling practices across America. By May, the case had reached the desk of Missouri Governor Forrest Smith, who received petitions from Shannon County residents demanding the family compound be disbanded in the interest of public morality and the welfare of the remaining children. Meanwhile, Judith Ledbetter began showing signs of recovery. Her attending physician, Dr. Margaret Collins, documented her progress. "Patient now communicates more freely and demonstrates improved affect. However, she remains confused about her relationship with her grandfather and the resulting pregnancy. She expresses attachment to her infant son but limited understanding of his medical conditions." If you're watching this story unfold and feeling the weight of this American tragedy, leave a comment saying some bloodlines should never cross. Your words acknowledge the devastating reality these isolated communities faced when genetic boundaries were erased. On May 18, 1952, as Thomas Ledbetter's trial date approached, a surprising development occurred. A delegation of women from neighboring hollows arrived at the hospital where Judith was recovering. Led by Martha Hawkins, whose family had lived in nearby Sweetwater Hollow for 5 generations, they requested permission to visit with Judith. Hospital administrators initially refused, but Dr. Collins recognized a potential breakthrough. "These women understand Judith's background in ways we cannot," she wrote. "Their insight may prove valuable to her recovery." The meeting lasted 3 hours. No medical staff were permitted to attend at the women's insistence. But Martha Hawkins later provided a statement. "We talked with Judith woman to woman about things outsiders wouldn't understand. Life in the Hollows is different. Sometimes terrible things happen when families get too turned in on themselves. We've seen it before." We told her there's no shame in what happened to her, but there's no going back either. Following this meeting, Judith made a decision that shocked her medical team. She requested to speak with Prosecutor Jenkins and offered to testify against her grandfather. According to Jenkins' notes of the interview, Judith stated, "Martha helped me see clear. What happened wasn't right, even if I didn't know it then. The babies show it wasn't right." This testimony fundamentally altered the case against Thomas Ledbetter. What had been a challenging prosecution with an unwilling victim suddenly became considerably stronger. Thomas Ledbetter's court-appointed attorney, James Mitchell, approached the prosecutor about a plea arrangement. On June 2, 1952, Thomas Ledbetter pleaded guilty to reduced charges. Judge Wilson Harrington sentenced him to 7 years at Missouri State Penitentiary, the maximum allowed under the charges. In delivering the sentence, Harrington stated, "While this court acknowledges the unusual circumstances of isolation that may have contributed to distorted moral understanding, the protection of vulnerable individuals and the natural order of family relations must be upheld. The remaining question concerned the future of the Ledbetter compound and its residents. County authorities, with state support, organized an intervention. The 7 minor children still living at the compound were placed in foster care. The adults were offered assistance relocating to more connected communities and provided with vocational training opportunities." Eleanor Ledbetter, Judith's mother, initially resisted these efforts but ultimately accepted placement in a state-supported residential facility in Jefferson City, where records indicate she was diagnosed with constitutional psychopathic inferiority, a term then used to describe various personality disorders. As summer arrived, bringing humid heat to the Ozarks, the once populated Ledbetter Hollow fell silent. County records indicate the property was eventually sold for back taxes in 1956. Forests gradually reclaimed the clearings and the cabins deteriorated into the landscape. For Judith and her surviving son William, the future remained uncertain but hopeful. The final chapter of their story would reveal both unexpected challenges and remarkable resilience. As autumn painted the Ozark Mountains with brilliant reds and golds in 1952, the Ledbetter case transitioned from newspaper headlines to medical textbooks. The surviving twin William, now 7 months old, had become a subject of intense medical interest. Representing one of the most comprehensively documented cases of genetic disorders resulting from consanguinity in American medical history, Dr. Victor McCusick, who had examined the Ledbetter family earlier that year, secured funding from the newly established National Institute of Health to conduct a longitudinal study of William's development. His research team documented an extensive list of congenital conditions: microcephaly, abnormally small head circumference, polydactyly, extra digits, bilateral ptosis, drooping eyelids, severe intellectual disability, seizure disorder, congenital heart defects, and skeletal malformations. William Ledbetter's medical profile presents a convergence of recessive genetic disorders, rarely seen in clinical settings, McCusick wrote in his 1953 preliminary paper for the Journal of Medical Genetics. The case provides compelling evidence of the catastrophic effects of extreme inbreeding, particularly when compounded over multiple generations. While William received specialized care at Children's Mercy Hospital in Kansas City, his mother Judith began a remarkable journey of personal transformation. Court records indicate she was placed under the guardianship of the state and enrolled in a residential education program for young women with limited educational backgrounds. Martha Hawkins, the woman from Sweetwater Hollow who had helped Judith understand her situation, maintained contact through letters preserved in the Shannon County Historical Society archives. These letters chronicled Judith's progress. "Dear Martha, the teachers here are helping me learn to read better. I can write my full name now and read simple books. They say I'm making good progress. I think about William every day. The doctors send pictures. He doesn't look like other babies, but they say he's getting stronger. Sometimes I cry, thinking about everything. But Mrs. Patterson, her counselor, says that's normal and healthy." Judith Ledbetter, September 1952 by early 1953. The Ledbetter case had captured the attention of the emerging field of genetic counseling. Dr. Sheldon Reed, who had coined the term genetic counseling just a few years earlier, used the case as a teaching example in his lectures at the University of Minnesota. What makes the Ledbetter situation so valuable from an educational perspective is how it demonstrates the cumulative effect of consanguineous relationships, Reed explained in a 1954 medical conference presentation. A single instance of close biological relatives producing offspring carries significant risk. But when this occurs in a family already compromised by generations of cousin marriages, the genetic consequences multiply exponentially. Williams's first birthday in February 1953 passed with little celebration. Medical records indicate he had the developmental capabilities of a 3-month-old infant, could not sit unassisted, and showed minimal response to stimuli. His care had been transferred to a state residential facility for children with severe disabilities in St. Louis, where the medical staff continued to document his condition for research purposes. Meanwhile, the broader impact of the case continued to ripple through both medical and social spheres in Shannon County and surrounding Ozark communities. Local doctors began offering informal genetic counseling to families known to have practiced cousin marriages. County Extension Services distributed educational materials about the risks of intermarriage to remote communities. Reverend John Pearson of First Baptist Church in Thornfield organized a community outreach program targeting isolated hollows. His church newsletters from this period reflect the delicate approach required. We must reach our brothers and sisters in the remote regions, not with judgment, but with compassion and practical assistance. Many families have lived for generations with limited contact beyond their immediate community, developing practices that may harm future generations unintentionally. By the summer of 1953, Judith Ledbetter had progressed sufficiently in her educational program to be granted supervised visitation with her son. Staff notes from Williams' facility document these visits. Mother interacted appropriately with child considering his limitations, displayed natural maternal behaviors including gentle touch, speaking softly, and appropriate emotional attachment. Expressed sadness at his condition but no visible signs of rejection. Thomas Ledbetter, serving his sentence at Missouri's State Penitentiary, maintained his innocence regarding any wrongdoing despite his guilty plea. Prison psychological evaluations described him as genuinely confused about societal boundaries regarding family relationships and noted he expressed no remorse beyond feeling sad the babies weren't right. Dr. Margaret Collins, who continued to monitor Judith's progress, published a paper in the Journal of Rural Sociology examining the social factors that contributed to the Ledbetter situation. She wrote, "The extreme geographic and cultural isolation experienced by certain Ozark communities created conditions where deviant behaviors could normalize across generations. What mainstream society views as fundamental taboos became blurred in environments where outside social influences were absent for decades." In October 1953, the case received renewed attention when Life magazine published a feature article titled "Hidden America: Isolated Communities and Their Forgotten Challenges." While the article didn't mention the Ledbetters by name, it referenced a recent case in the Missouri Ozarks and included interviews with doctors and social workers about the consequences of extreme isolation. This national exposure prompted Missouri Governor Phil M. Donnelly to establish a commission investigating isolated rural communities throughout the state. Their 1954 report identified 27 settlements classified as critically isolated, with residents having minimal contact with outside society, limited understanding of laws and norms, and concerning patterns of intermarriage. As 1954 progressed, Judith Ledbetter's story took an unexpected turn. Having completed her basic education program, she was offered employment as a kitchen assistant at the very facility where she had received treatment. Her counselor noted, "Judith has demonstrated remarkable resilience and adaptability. While she continues to require some supervision and support, her progress suggests potential for semi-independent living with appropriate community supports." For William, however, the prognosis remained unchanged. Quarterly medical evaluations documented minimal developmental progress, chronic health challenges, and a growing list of complications. By his second birthday, he had undergone 3 additional surgeries to address hydrocephalus and orthopedic issues. Dr. McCusick's research team continued to monitor William's condition, and their findings contributed significantly to the emerging understanding of genetic inheritance patterns. The Ledbetter case would eventually be referenced in McCusick's groundbreaking 1966 publication, Mendelian Inheritance in Man, which became a foundational text in medical genetics. As the scientific community gained insights from William's condition, the social aftermath of the Ledbetter case continued to transform life in the Ozarks. County records indicate a gradual but significant decrease in the number of marriage licenses issued to couples sharing surnames or known family connections. More profound was the decline in extremely isolated homesteads. The commission established by Governor Donnelly facilitated road improvements, rural electrification projects, and mobile health clinics specifically targeting remote hollows. These initiatives gradually connected previously isolated communities to mainstream society. The Ledbetter tragedy, while devastating for those directly involved, ultimately catalyzed positive changes for similar communities throughout the Ozarks, observed sociologist Dr. James Williams in a 1957 follow-up study. Infrastructure improvements, educational outreach, and increased medical access have significantly reduced the conditions that allowed such extreme isolation to persist into the mid-20th century. The spring of 1959 brought gentle rains to the Ozarks, transforming Blackberry Hollow into a lush green landscape that betrayed no hint of the tragedy that had unfolded there 7 years earlier. The Ledbetter homestead had long since been reclaimed by nature, with only stone foundations and a collapsed chimney marking where generations had lived in isolation. For Judith Ledbetter, now 24 years old, life had taken an unexpected path towards stability. Records from the Shannon County Social Services Department indicate she had been released from state guardianship in 1957, having demonstrated sufficient improvement in cognitive functioning and social adaptation. She had secured employment as a laundry worker at Baxter Memorial Hospital in Mountain Home, Arkansas, living in supervised housing for women with similar backgrounds. Her counselor's final report noted, "Judith has developed remarkably considering her starting point. She manages her finances with minimal assistance, maintains appropriate workplace behavior, and has formed healthy friendships with coworkers. While she continues to exhibit some developmental limitations, her daily functioning exceeds all initial projections." Martha Hawkins, the woman who had helped Judith understand her situation years earlier, maintained correspondence throughout this period. In a letter dated April 1959, Judith wrote, "Dear Martha, I have saved enough money to buy a radio. The ladies I live with are teaching me to bake pies to sell at church functions. I visited William last month. He doesn't know me, but I still bring him soft toys. The nurses say he likes music. I'm learning to accept things as they are." William Ledbetter, now 7 years old, remained in institutional care at the state hospital in Farmington, Missouri. His medical records paint a stark picture of profound disability. He never developed speech, could not walk independently, suffered frequent seizures despite medication, and required assistance with all aspects of daily living. Dr. Victor McCusick's research team continued to document Williams's condition, though their focus had shifted to using his case as a teaching example rather than expecting new medical insights. In a 1958 lecture to medical students at Washington University, McCusick explained, "The Ledbetter case represents an extreme example of genetic collapse resulting from consanguinity. The child exhibits multiple recessive disorders that would typically appear in perhaps 1 in several million births in the general population, but became tragically probable due to the concentration of recessive genes in his family line." Thomas Ledbetter, who had been sentenced to 7 years imprisonment in 1952, was released on parole in December 1957. Parole records indicate he initially returned to Shannon County but found himself unwelcome in a community that had not forgotten the scandal. He subsequently relocated to eastern Oklahoma, where distant relatives provided housing on their farm. His parole officer noted he remained socially isolated by choice and circumstance, but complied with all conditions of his release. Eleanor Ledbetter, Judith's mother and Thomas's daughter, spent her remaining years at State Hospital No. 3 in Nevada, Missouri. Her medical records indicate a diagnosis of chronic melancholia with paranoid features, treated with the limited psychiatric methods of the era. She passed away in October 1958 from complications of pneumonia, having never reconciled with her father or daughter. The broader impact of the Ledbetter case continued to influence medical and social practice throughout the Ozarks and beyond. In 1960, the Missouri Department of Health established the Rural Genetic Counseling Initiative, sending trained professionals to county extension offices specifically to address concerns about genetic risks in historically isolated communities. Dr. Margaret Collins, whose work with Judith had shaped her understanding of rural social dynamics, published an influential paper titled "Cultural Isolation and Genetic Consequences in Rural American Communities" in 1961. She wrote, "The Ozark region's unique geography created pockets of extreme isolation that persisted well into the 20th century. These conditions allowed for the development of alternate family structures and marriage patterns that increased genetic risk. Understanding these historical patterns is essential for effective interventions in similar communities that may still exist." The most lasting scientific legacy came through Dr. McCusick's continued research. His observations of William Ledbetter and subsequent genetic studies of other isolated Ozark communities contributed significantly to the mapping of recessive inherited disorders. When McCusick published the first edition of Mendelian Inheritance in Man in 1966, several conditions identified in William were included with references to a case study from rural Missouri. For William himself, life remained circumscribed by profound disability. In November 1962, at age 10, he developed respiratory complications that his weakened system could not overcome. Hospital records indicate he passed away on November 14th, with the cause listed as pneumonia secondary to congenital disorders. Judith was notified of her son's passing and attended a simple funeral service arranged by the state hospital. The attending social worker noted, Miss Ledbetter displayed appropriate grief, but also expressed that William was at peace now. She brought wildflowers she had collected herself and requested they be placed with him. In the years that followed, Judith maintained the life she had built. County records indicate she eventually moved into independent housing in 1965, though she continued to receive periodic supportive services. She never married or had additional children, a decision she explained in a letter to Martha Hawkins. The doctors told me any children I might have could have problems because of my family history. I've made peace with that. Some bloodlines weren't meant to continue. Thomas Ledbetter died in 1971 at age 76, having lived his final years in obscurity. His death certificate lists natural causes with no further details. No obituary appeared in local papers, and cemetery records indicate a simple burial with no attendees. By the early 1970s, the infrastructure improvements initiated in response to the Ledbetter case and similar situations had dramatically transformed the Ozark region. Paved roads reached previously isolated hollows, rural electrification was nearly complete, and telephone service had expanded to most areas. The conditions that had allowed the Ledbetter family to exist in extreme isolation for generations no longer existed in the region. In 1974, the Shannon County Historical Society commissioned a comprehensive study of the county's demographic changes since 1950. Their report concluded, the pattern of isolated family compounds maintaining separate existence from mainstream society has essentially disappeared from the county. Improved transportation infrastructure, expanded education access, and increased economic opportunities have integrated previously isolated populations. Judith Ledbetter's final documented appearance in public records comes from 1982, when at age 48 she provided testimony to researchers from the University of Missouri conducting an oral history project on rural Ozark life. The transcript captures her reflection 30 years after the events that shaped her life. I don't blame anyone anymore. Not my grandfather, not my mother, not even myself. None of us knew any different. We lived the only way we knew how, cut off from everything. When you live that way for generations, what's wrong starts to seem right just because it's all you've ever known. The doctors explained to me about the blood being too close, about how that hurt William. I understand now why things happened the way they did. I hope others can learn from our story. If you've watched this entire documentary about one of America's most tragic genetic stories, leave a comment saying I watched until the end, so I can get to know who truly appreciates these historical investigations. Make sure you're subscribed to this channel for more hidden American histories. Hit the like button if you found this story enlightening, and share with others who appreciate learning about these forgotten chapters of our past. These stories, though difficult, help us understand the importance of community connection and the dangers of extreme isolation. The legacy of the Ledbetter family serves as a powerful reminder of how geographic isolation, lack of education, and generational practices can create conditions where tragedy becomes inevitable. Their story contributed to fundamental changes in rural outreach, genetic counseling, and medical understanding that have benefited countless others. In this way, from the darkest circumstances came knowledge that continues to prevent similar suffering to this day.